I'd like to start. My colleague and co-chair, Robert Litvak, couldn't be here today, so we'll have to go without him. Let me offer a welcome on behalf of the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Los Alamos National Laboratory. This event is one in the series of events we have called the Non-Proliferation Forum. The National Nuclear Security Administration, along with the national laboratories, are the principal repositories of the United States government's technical capabilities and expertise for dealing with nuclear proliferation and terrorism. It should be remembered that this expertise and capabilities developed largely from the nuclear weapon program and continues to be influenced by the nuclear weapon program. But given NNSA's role in this very important area, one that is clearly expanding, has there been more continuity than change in the past? I think that's the case. It's certainly my view. I think if we look past back to the past several administrations, we see far more continuity than change in NNSA's non-proliferation and counter-proliferation efforts. And we might expect the same with the new administration coming in. But there will be changes, and each administration has left their mark on policy. To discuss the Bush legacy, we're very fortunate to have with us William H. Tobey, until Friday, the Deputy Administrator for NNSA's Office of Defense Nuclear Non-Proliferation. At NNSA, he was responsible for managing programs to prevent the spread of materials, technology, and expertise relating to nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction, and to eliminate inventories of surplus fissile material. Prior to serving at NNSA, Mr. Tobey served on the National Security Council in the Reagan administration, in the administration of George H.W. Bush, and in the administration of the current president, the past President Bush, excuse me. He worked on defense policy, arms control, and non-proliferation issues. Involved in negotiations, including the nuclear and space talks with the Soviet Union and the six-party talk on North Korea's nuclear program. He has a significant private sector experience, including in the financial world as well as in the venture capitalist world. He will be taking a position as a senior fellow at Harvard University. Will.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I should add, in fairness, that you were reading from an old website page, and with respect to some of that, I'm delighted to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about a program which I came to be extremely proud of. The people that I worked with are tremendous people, and in fact, one of the things I'll do today is talk a little bit about them. I'd like to talk about the mission, the scope of the work, the people who do it, some of the progress that was made, and then offer a provisional thesis about sort of the state of play with respect to nuclear security and the threats of nuclear terrorism and proliferation. Over the past 2.5 years, I led an organization whose mission was to detect, secure, and dispose of dangerous nuclear material in order to prevent nuclear terrorism and proliferation. We work closely with the Departments of State, Defense, and Homeland Security, as well as the White House, and we're supported by the intelligence community. With a budget of about $2 billion, the National Nuclear Security Administration's non-proliferation effort is the largest such program within the United States government and indeed the world. We worked with or in over 100 nations around the world. We also received almost $50 million in contributions from 7 other countries, which I believe is unique within the United States government. The Congress gave us the authority to accept international donations for 4 of our major programmatic efforts, and we accepted these enthusiastically, both because of the additional work that we could do, but also because it provided some political and diplomatic leverage to be able to undertake these programs in a multilateral way. We've implemented 18 specific programs through 6 broad areas of effort, and I will go through those 6 areas in some greater detail in a moment. But first, I did want to talk a little bit about the people, because they do such a terrific job, and I think they're little known. There were 400 civil servants and contractor personnel, including many from the national labs, who work on this program, and they're supported by additional people in the national labs and also literally thousands of contractor personnel, particularly at the large construction projects. In recent years, these 400 people have won 3 Service to America awards, which are the civil service equivalent of the Oscar, only it's a great deal more competitive because there are 2 million civil servants and not 2 million people who participate in the movie business. Some 60% of those 400 people that I talked about have at least a master's degree. There are 40-plus PhDs. There are 125-plus foreign language speakers speaking an aggregate total of 25 foreign languages. They took in an average year, 6,000 foreign trips, spending 100,000 nights cumulatively away from home. They work hard in difficult conditions in faraway places, and I think they do excellent work. With respect to the progress that's been made, I'd like to talk about 6 areas. First, securing civilian nuclear and radiological materials worldwide. This area is divided into 2 major efforts: converting reactors using highly enriched uranium to low-enriched uranium and returning the fresh and spent fuel to the United States and Russia for secure storage, and then also securing radiological materials, both in the United States and overseas. With respect to the reactor conversions, we've converted 57 reactors in 32 countries, and an additional 5 have been shut down. This has enabled us to return almost 2,000 kilograms of highly enriched uranium to either the United States or Russia for secure storage. We've also secured some 540 buildings overseas containing radiological sources and recovered almost 19,000 radiological sources domestically. The second major area was in securing Russian nuclear weapons material. And that work obviously has been going on for a long time. But we, I think, reached a substantial milestone with the completion of the Bratislava Initiative, which one of the major elements of which was to complete nuclear weapons materials security work within Russia. In late 2004 and early 2005, large elements of the United States government became concerned with the scope and pace of security work in Russia. And as a consequence, there was a high-level effort to reach the Russians and persuade them that this work needed to be expanded and the pace needed to be quickened. This included an approach to the then Russian Defense Minister, Sergei Ivanov, and it led to the so-called Bratislava Initiative agreed to by Presidents Bush and Putin in February of 2005. That process allowed us to greatly expand the scope of the work in Russia to make it very nearly comprehensive. and I would argue so comprehensive that we need not worry about any remaining work, at least not deeply. And then it also set specific deadlines for completion of the work, specifically the end of 2008. It was a massive undertaking, and I think there were people at the time who thought that it wasn't possible. I'm happy to report that we completed the goal, that the work at some 148 sites, 123 of those sites worked on by elements of the Department of Energy, 25 of them worked on by the Department of Defense, has essentially been completed. We did receive some additional scope of work that was agreed to with the Russians after the Bratislava Initiative, and that work will unfold over the next year or two. I think that's all to the good. We tried to get it done within the Bratislava timeframe, but it simply wasn't possible given the constraints of short construction seasons, limited numbers of Russian contractors that were both capable of doing the work and cleared to be in sensitive facilities. So that work will continue, but I think it is well in hand. And I would also point out that it's largely at sites that have already received a great deal of security work. So while this additional work is important, it's not occurring at sites that are unguarded by any means. The third major element of our work was to detect and to deter illicit nuclear transfers. In this regard, the work started by equipping Russian border crossings with radiological detectors as a second line of defense. Should the first line of defense, the guns, guards, and gates at nuclear facilities themselves, fail, we hope to detect any illicit transfers by putting these detectors at border crossings. We've equipped some 160 such border crossings in Russia and agreed to accelerate progress on the balance of the border crossings to complete the work in 2011, which was 5 years ahead of the previous schedule. That work will also be conducted jointly by Russia and the United States, with each side bearing roughly half the cost. Outside of Russia, we've also expanded the work, installing megaport detection systems at 19 ports, with work underway at 20 additional ports. We also have 53 operational international border crossing radiation detection operations at land, rail, and smaller ports in 12 countries. We've also stepped up the review of export license requests involving proliferation-sensitive material. Over the past year, we reviewed almost a little over 7,200 licenses and recommended denial of 197 of those licenses. The fourth major area has been to strengthen international non-proliferation efforts and regimes. In this regard, we've worked closely with the IAEA. We launched the Next Generation Safeguards Initiative to give the IAEA better tools to deal with proliferation issues. We observed that just as the American nuclear industry had essentially lain fallow over the past 30 years, so too had the safeguards technology. And as a result, the safeguards technology is somewhat outdated, but perhaps even more importantly, the capabilities of U.S. and other scientific personnel had to some extent atrophied. At the very least, they'd been sort of caught in time where a whole generation of people who were expert in these fields began to retire, and we weren't training new individuals who could bring about new technologies. And so this effort, which is intended to devote some tens of millions of dollars each year to updating safeguards, should, we believe, considerably strengthen the IAEA's hand. We also have engaged thousands of former weapons scientists in the former Soviet Union, in Libya and Iraq, helping to redirect them toward the civil sector. We've trained 6,400 domestic export control officials and over 11,000 international export control officials on weapons of mass destruction technology identification. The goal is to put a trained eye on the scene because in many cases, even very sensitive technology is not immediately recognizable as significant. The fifth major element of our effort has been to eliminate weapons usable material or to prevent production of additional material. I'm happy to report that last spring we shut down 2 of the last 3 plutonium production reactors in Russia. These were Soviet-era reactors that were in bad shape. They were designed to produce plutonium for the Soviet weapons program, but they became necessary to provide steam and electricity for surrounding communities within Siberia. And as a consequence, in the 1990s, it was agreed that the United States would build fossil fuel power plants that would replace those capabilities for the communities in Russia and enable the shutdown of the reactors. Those 2 reactors at Seversk were shut down in April and June, 6 and 8 months early of last year. And the last reactor we hope will be shut down in September of this year, which would be about 15 months early. Despite rising concrete and steel costs and what had been, anyway, a tight labor market in Russia, those projects were brought in on budget and, as I said, seemingly ahead of schedule. We hope that all 3 will be shut down ahead of schedule. This will enable us to prevent the production of about 1.5 tons of weapons-grade plutonium each year. The next major element in our elimination of weapons-grade material program has been the Heu Purchase Agreement. We've purchased over 320 metric tons of Russian highly enriched uranium. Roughly 20% of American electricity is produced by nuclear power. Half of that is fueled under this program. So on average, 1 in 10 light bulbs in America is powered by a weapon that was once aimed at ourselves or our allies. And all of that material now will not be usable by either proliferators or terrorists. The third major element of this program is the elimination of weapons-grade plutonium program. Then Vice President Gore and his counterpart in Russia agreed to eliminate 34 metric tons of weapons-grade plutonium each in the United States and Russia. In August of 2007, we began construction of a fuel fabrication facility that will take the U.S. material and turn it into reactor fuel for civilian nuclear energy reactors. When that 34 metric tons is turned into reactor fuel, it will provide enough energy for 1 million households for 50 years. And since then, Secretary of Energy Bodman has declared an additional 9 metric tons of plutonium as excess to defense needs, and that will very likely be run through the same process. So that will only add to those totals. Secretary Bodman also agreed with his Russian counterpart on what we believe is a technically and financially credible path for the Russian plutonium disposition program, which had been sidetracked for a fairly long time with arguments about exactly how they should do it. What we agreed to was that they will use fast reactors in a way that's compatible with overall Russian energy plans. And that's part of why we believe it's financially credible, because they're going to have to bear a significant portion of the cost, and it only makes sense if it's consistent with their energy plans overall. Then finally, we in the United States have, and I had as a program, a very robust research and development program for non-proliferation research and development. That's divided in turn into 2 different areas. First, the manufacture of all the detectors that are used by the United States to detect nuclear detonations, space-based and ground-based. And those, in fact, were put to use when North Korea detonated its weapon a couple of years ago. And then finally, there's a robust effort to detect both illicit nuclear material and illicit programs. So both the material itself when in commerce and the programs as countries undertake them. And that obviously can be put to use both for U.S. purposes, but also aids the IAEA in its efforts. So my bottom line is that there has been some significant progress over the last 10 or 15 years through, I believe, 3 administrations. And I would offer a provisional thesis, one which I'm sure that people here would be likely to want to discuss. And I emphasize that it's a provisional thesis because it's one that I would like to discuss with you. And that is that while it is impossible to say in an absolute sense that we are safe from nuclear terrorism, none of us can know what may be going on in various basements around the world. I do believe that by any objective measure, in terms of the availability of the material or the steps that we have in place to monitor or intercept it before it's transferred, we are much safer than we were 10 or 15 years ago. And I would argue that in large measure that's due to the hard work of the civil servants and lab personnel of the National Nuclear Security Administration. And with that, I'd be happy to take some questions.
Thank you, Will. There's a lot on the table. We have time for questions. Please state your name and affiliation when you speak. Yes.
Hi, Michael Adler from the Wilson Center. I'm just curious, is there any sign that Iran or a terrorist group has obtained a weapon or parts of a weapon or material that has not been declared to the IAEA?
I'm unaware of any.
Even material that might have been misplaced in the days just following the breakup of the communist states? It's just a matter of confusion for a few years.
I'm unaware of any. The reason I hesitated before answering was you spoke of both a terrorist group and Iran. And the IAEA has spoken of potentially illicit activity by Iran and transfers to Iran. And if you exclude what the IAEA has disclosed already about that, then I would certainly be unaware of any.
I'm Jay Park with Radio Creation. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience working with North Koreans to denuclearize their nuclear program? Especially as you know, South Korean government like to buy their fresh, unused nuclear rod. How do you predict their initiative? Any further experience?
Well, National Nuclear Security Administration personnel have been at Yongbyon essentially 24/7 since November 1st of 2007, monitoring the disablement of nuclear facilities in North Korea. Despite that experience, I would probably be the last one in this room to try and predict what North Korea might wish to do. I can say that North Korea had agreed to either bend to make unusable or to sell the fresh fuel rods that you refer to, but so far, to my knowledge anyway, has not yet undertaken that. It would be necessary to take such steps in order to complete the disablement of those facilities.
Do you think what would be the main causes to buy those fresh?
As far as I know, the only hurdle would be North Korea. And if they're truly committed to abandoning all their nuclear weapons and all existing nuclear facilities, as they agreed in the joint statement of September 15th, 2005, then it would only be logical that they'd be willing to give up this fuel.
So your position right now is pretty suspicious.
Well, I don't know as I would call it suspicious, but I would certainly want to wait and see what happens. And I'm not one that's eager to predict what North Korea will or will not do.
Jogi Thomas from CRDF. One of the liberating things about leaving government is that you can get out of the box and think about the things you should have done or might not fit with current government programs. Is there something that you really think, gee, I wish I had a do-over, I would like to take one more piece that would make us safer?
Well, you have to indulge me because it's only been a few days, and it's some of those constraints have become so ingrained that it's difficult to transcend them. During the whole of the 2.5 years, I was eager to hear new ideas, and in fact, we got several of them and tried to implement them, and I think I very much appreciate those. In fact, we worked with the Nuclear Threat Initiative on the World Institute of Nuclear Security, which was their idea, but a very good one, and I think we helped to get it off the ground. And I can point to a few others that I needn't go into. And in fact, I had a similar experience with the various commissions that would occasionally be looking at these areas. And they would come to me and say, well, do you have any new ideas we want to put in our report? And my answer to them was always, well, if we have new ideas, we'll try and implement them. And if you have new ideas, tell us now, even before it's in your report, and we'll work on it. So if there were obvious new ideas, we would have tried to undertake them. There were a few things that we tried to do but didn't get done while I was in the government. And I'll cite one there, so as not to completely duck your question. One of the areas which I'm concerned about is radiological source security. And I think, frankly, I cited the fact that we'd secured 19,000 such sources within the United States. I think that's a great accomplishment. I also think it's a mark of public policy that's not working. I think we ought to have a better, more systematic approach to those sources, one that's market and regulatory based. I think that companies that buy this material should be responsible for its safe storage and disposition, and that those costs ought to be internalized. We actually made some progress on some of those areas, and I think the industry actually wants to be responsible. One thought that we had was that when oil prices went up, one of the applications for radiological sources is so-called well logging devices, in order to map underground structures and decide where it would be productive to drill for oil. Those sources were largely turned into the U.S. government when oil prices were down during the 1990s, and the oil services companies didn't want to have to store and protect them. Now, a year ago, with the price of oil way up, those same companies came and said that they would like the sources back. One natural response might be, heck no, we got them fair and square, you can't have them. The response that I was interested in pursuing was, well, let's see if we can work something out here where if these sources are made available to you, you need to make sure that they're protected and disposed of properly. But more than that all of the sources under your control, both in the United States and outside of the United States, are properly disposed of. And we actually got 5 or 6 of the largest oil services companies to agree to a code of conduct that would govern their behavior both inside the United States and outside the United States with respect to these sources. That's the good news. The bad news is that I was never able to get through the various legal hurdles within the department, our own lawyers, in essence, a structure that would be capable of pulling off that trade. I still think it's one that's available to the next administration, and I hope it's an idea that they take a look at.
Sam.
Sam Wells, Wilson Center. Mr. Tobey, I would like to pursue further the question about the quality of the radiological detection devices that are both in the United States and at various major ports around the country. In his recently published book, David Sanger, the volume The Inheritance, says that one of the big challenges is the protection of the United States from the import of radiological material. And he quotes some Custom and Border Protection officials as saying that many of the devices give false positives when they're going through these big container shipments as frequently as 400 times a day. And that may be what you referred to when you said we had outdated equipment and it's not functioning properly, but could you speak more about that? And would you find that your experience would tend to confirm what others told Mr. Sanger?
Well, it is a difficult problem. But to put it in perspective, the mission that I believe that we are undertaking is not necessarily to guarantee detection of every piece of material in any particular cargo container, but rather to attempt to deter international transfers. And to that extent, it's, especially if a state is involved in such transfer, you have to look at the probability that they will be caught as part of their deterrence equation. And that probability need not be 100% in order to deter them. With respect to false positives, this is clearly an evolving technology. And with respect to the United States, I should be clear that the work for container shipments coming to the United States directly is undertaken by the Department of Homeland Security. Our mission was to deploy detectors in ports around the world that would detect such material regardless of its origin or destination. And we tended to concentrate on areas in the world where we thought were the most likely potential sources of leakage of nuclear material. So first we were working in former Soviet states. And while I was there, one of the ways in which we shifted was to provide greater emphasis to shipping lanes that might include traffic from either North Korea or South Asia, whether or not it was ultimately bound for the United States. The Department of Homeland Security has fielded somewhat different equipment than we have. They deal with much higher volumes than we do at many of our ports, and so they've fielded equipment that's much more expensive, but it is more capable as well. How they calibrate that, I think, is a difficult problem that'll have to be worked through. It's never going to be 100% effective, and we shouldn't count on it as being 100% effective. The goal here is to deter and to use it as a part of an overall process of trying to detect and deter illicit transfers. I think we're not clear who you...
Jerry Olick, retired intelligence officer and nuclear arms control inspector. When I heard your bio, I expected the nuclear mushroom cloud theory and the politics of fear, but I was very pleasantly surprised to hear your accomplishments and especially your assessment of how safe we are from the nuclear threat as far as terrorists are concerned. My question has to do with miniaturization of a nuclear weapon. Kind of argues against what we both believe is the threat, but it has to do with that nuclear suitcase idea that was prevalent during the Soviet Union days, where you could weaponize something into 30-pound size suitcase, a nuclear weapon. And given that the Soviets already had nuclear artillery, nuclear landmines, and we did too, it's obvious you can miniaturize. But could somebody like the Khan network be able to make a weapon that was so transportable and difficult to detect, which would have a yield which would be devastating and would be, in terms of a nuclear cloud, very catastrophic?
I'm unaware of any such activities by the Con network. I should hesitate, or I should also hasten to add that with respect to my thesis, which I think is an encouraging and an optimistic one, it's meant to put these efforts in perspective. It's not in any way meant to diminish the need for such programs. I think actually it's a mark of their success, and it means that we should continue them. There are many, for example, research reactors that continue to use highly enriched uranium, so we need to work hard to convert those, and if we can accelerate those efforts, it's all to the good. So while I'm happy to share, as I said, this provisional thesis with you, I would also hasten to add that in no way does this diminish the urgency of the work. It doesn't mean that we should cut back on funding for these programs until they're completed. It doesn't in any way mean that we should cut back on the emphasis that both parties have given to them over the last 10 years or so, or more.
Hello. Nate Young, Department of State. I'm still in the government, so I should be very careful how I phrase this question. I was wondering if you could share your personal views on what the new administration should do about the issue of sustainability of the upgrades made under the Bratislava Initiative at nuclear sites in Russia, especially given the current economic downturn and the struggles Rosatom might face in addressing this issue.
I think that's an excellent question on an important issue. We've made a $2.5 billion investment in Russian nuclear security, and sadly, at least as I understand it, the whole history of the Russian military has been one that has not dealt well with problems of maintenance and sustainability and logistics. It is a big issue. And even before the downturn, which you correctly cite, I think there were questions about Russian capabilities and intentions in this area. Just because Gazprom is doing well doesn't mean that every institute in Siberia is doing well. Just because some sectors of the Russian economy are doing fine doesn't mean that the whole of the nuclear industry is. I think that within Russia, the enthusiasm for this work varies considerably between organizations. I think that the 12th GUMO has demonstrated, that's the 12th Main Directorate that's in charge of storing and fielding Russian nuclear weapons, has demonstrated a high degree of professionalism. I think that some other areas within the Russian nuclear structure have not. And I think that will be an issue that the next administration will likely wish to focus considerable attention on. And I think it will, if a Bratislava II were possible, one element of Bratislava II might be ensuring sustainability. I would also add, though, that cooperation with Russia on nuclear security has been a real bright spot in the relationship. That the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, the Bratislava Initiative, and in fact even a joint statement that was issued at Sochi, all showed considerable cooperation between the two governments and real high-level attention on this problem. So I think that there is an opening there should the next administration wish to pursue it as an issue.
This is sort of on the same subject. I think I
1 second, the mic's coming to you.
your thesis.
And name and affiliation.
I agree with your thesis that our non-proliferation efforts in Russia and elsewhere have reduced the risk from nuclear smuggling, nuclear theft, and so on. I guess the question is that a lot of the improvement that we've seen in terms of reduced theft attempts or reduced appearance of nuclear materials in international black markets That's also, I think, due or has been due to the improvement of the economic situation in Russia. Well, now we face a very different situation. We now see the ruble, the value of the ruble is collapsing. The price of oil has declined to $40 or less a barrel. And the question is, I mean, even with all this, all the equipment and technology we put in Russia, I think this has been certainly helped. But to what extent do you feel that this could be undermined, should we say, by these unfavorable economic factors that we see ahead of us?
I think that's a real danger. I did not see any evidence of it yet during my last visit to Russia, which was in December. But they did speak of what they called the crisis, which is even here, where the economic effects are significant. We haven't gotten to the point where there is only one crisis, and that's the one, the economic crisis. We're still dealing with, I guess, several crises, but it has not become so pervasive that one can use that noun for it. I think that this is an area that will deserve sustained attention. They are in somewhat better shape than they were before, if for no other reason than they have physical measures that are in place that won't go away easily. The guard posts, the electronic surveillance measures, the metal detectors, et cetera, are all there. What they will need to do is pay the troops to man them. And we know that that was a problem in the 1990s, but I think the fact that there are these physical measures in place diminishes the consequences of, for example, small cuts among troops. So I think we're still better off than we were before, but it's an area that bears attention.
Hi, I'm Ezekiel Tan from the Center for Defense Information, and my question is a continuation of what the new Obama administration should do. As we all know that the START treaty, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, is expected to expire this coming December. So what has the NNSA done in the past few years or will be doing to facilitate the negotiation to support the extension or the renewal of the treaty?
We were a participant in interagency deliberations on the U.S. position with that, and the Russian government was given a proposal for essentially extending transparency elements of the START treaty. As you probably know, the START levels now are much higher than what either country has deployed, and in that sense are almost irrelevant. The Moscow Treaty, which is somewhat different in its requirements but still relevant, calls for much lower numbers of operationally deployed weapons. And so the idea was to combine the Moscow Treaty, which has these low levels of operationally deployed weapons, with an extension of the transparency elements of the START treaty, which were useful for both sides.
John Doyle, Aviation Week and Space Technology. I was wondering if you could perhaps categorize it in some shape or form where you think the greatest risk is in the short term, either a nuclear weapon in the hands of a nation state like Iran or North Korea, or a nuclear device, whether it's an actual bomb or a dirty bomb acquired by a non-state actor, a terrorist group. And will that change over the long term?
Well, your question's actually quite broad in that you included both nuclear weapons and radiological devices. A terrorist group has already actually acquired a radiological device. I think several years back, there was one in Russia, even before the Bush 43 administration. So I guess maybe if I could limit your question to nuclear devices, I think that the greatest danger at the moment is from nation states that would proliferate and might put those weapons to use, either directly or by passing them to a terrorist. And there, I think, the preeminent threats are from North Korea and Iran. We're working very, very hard to keep nuclear weapons and nuclear material away from terrorists, and I think that work has to go on, and it has to be undertaken vigorously and quickly. But so far, anyway, I think we're doing pretty well on that front.
Hello, sorry. David Blum, unaffiliated. I'm just curious, what is your position on when other nation states actually make an effort to stop nuclear proliferation? For example, when Israel attacked the Iraqi reactor in the 1980s, and when they attacked what was thought to be a nuclear reactor in Syria, what would your position be, what would the United States' position be if another country made that effort to stop, maybe by force or other means, nuclear proliferation?
Well, as a matter of general policy, we understand that nation states have an inherent right of self-defense, and that illicit nuclear programs on one's border could easily be interpreted as a threat to a state's security, and that therefore the right of self-defense would come into play. More broadly, we've tried to work with other nations through the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism to prevent the illicit transfer of nuclear weapons and nuclear material. That effort now includes some 70 nations and is aimed at the full spectrum of responses, from detection, prevention, deterrence, export controls, security, and in fact even in response to a particular terrorist incident. So overall, our goal has been to try and band together nations in order to work on an effective response against would-be terrorists or proliferators.
Yes.
My question deals with Russian nuclear security. I recall reading something. It may have dated as far back to the late 1990s, so it may be outdated. But the U.S. approach to nuclear security with respect to Russia is usually to give them, as I understood it, to give them technical means of securing their nuclear materials. You give them a radiation detector, you help them, you give them a great lock to lock things up, etc. But the problem that this article emphasized was that no matter how sophisticated the technology is, it doesn't work if it's not put to use. And it gave a number of anecdotes about, that there was a radiation portal, but no, I know Yevgeny, so he's not a threat. I'm just going to let him go around because it'll probably go off because it gives too many false positives. Or like a motion detector that was placed outside a facility, but it didn't work because the grass was let to get too tall, so it couldn't see anything, couldn't detect any motion to alert the guards. I was wondering how you at the NNSA addressed any of these cultural issues in addition to the technical problem of securing nuclear materials.
Security culture is an important part of what we do, and we have what amount to quarterly talks with the Russians on that. I think we've made some progress. I mean, the points that you cite, clearly were the sorts of things that were happening and may still, to some extent, happen in Russia and elsewhere. I mean, security, it's very difficult to be perfect with respect to security. We have our own problems in the United States, and there's no doubt about that. And we have tried to emphasize we recognize this. We're trying to work with them because it's in both of our interests, not because we have some pedant interest in teaching Russia. It's more of a cooperative program. They have come a long way with respect to security culture. And in fact, we've agreed on means for sustainability with Rosatom. We have a written agreement on what it will mean to sustain these upgrades over time, which includes training, personnel reliability programs, making sure there are adequate budgets, making sure that there's maintenance of both the physical facilities like cameras, but also the ground so that the grass doesn't grow too high. Actually, one of the biggest things that we did to improve security was to make sure that there was a clear line of sight beyond the perimeter of these facilities. During Soviet days, for whatever reason, they thought that having woods immediately around the facilities improved security. I guess what it did was it hid the actual facilities themselves. From our point of view, it provided cover for those who would break into facilities to essentially the last minute until they got to the perimeter. And so now you'll see that these facilities are cleared for at least 50 meters around the fences entirely. I guess that my answer would be similar to others I've given, which is you raise the right problem. It's one that we're worried about. We are talking to the Russians about it. I think by and large they've got it. They've made some real progress, but we can't let the matter rest either.
Are there any further? Yes.
Well, you've had a very long road. I'm sorry, Steve Streetman, Domestic Nuclear Detection Office. I bet you're reaching some major milestones in a lot of your programs. What will NNSA do next? Where will the mission evolve after this?
Well, I think that in addition to sustainability, which many people have talked about, and I think is a very important mission, even when I was in the government, we were pivoting in two ways. First of all, away from Russian nuclear weapons material security, because that work is winding down. We have largely succeeded there. But two efforts were ramping up considerably. The civil nuclear and radiological materials program that I talked about. And in that regard, for example, prior to Bratislava, in the equivalent Bratislava period, we had converted one reactor. In the Bratislava period, we converted 13 reactors. So there was a tremendous acceleration there. And we also accelerated the securing of radiological sources overseas. And I think that will have to continue, and it should continue. And then second, we accelerated the so-called second line of defense. And I talked about what we've done with megaports and border crossings. And I think that work will need to continue as well. So as we essentially, it's logical that you would pursue as your first effort first line of defense work directly affecting nuclear weapons or weapons usable material at their sites, but that as you complete that work, you move toward other material, the civil nuclear material, and then also the second line of defense work.
Just because you've spoken a lot about material, what about personnel, scientists? Do you feel you have a handle on the brain drain that was taking place, and how serious do you think that hemorrhaging was, once again, in states like Iran or other places until the present time?
My impression is that the brain drain was an issue largely in the 90s, but is no longer an issue. We have considerable programs. In fact, they were controversial over the last year or so, I think I would argue unfairly so, in terms of scientist engagement in Russia. But I was told in one of my first meetings with a senior Russian, he said candidly, and I think correctly, that when first these programs were begun, it was a matter of real need, that it was keeping body and soul together for some of these scientists. But now the economic conditions have changed considerably. This was before oil prices were very high, but it also was before what's going on there now. Just to put it in perspective, it was in September of '06. But that now it's a matter of genuine cooperation as equals between Russia and ourselves. The facilities that I visited, I didn't see any real economic dislocation. These all look like they were in pretty good shape, and I would expect that given the relatively ambitious nuclear plans in Russia, both for domestic purposes and for international purposes, if those plans, or even a fraction of them, can be sustained in the face of the economic crisis, there will be lots of employment opportunities for nuclear personnel.
from your position at NSA and also from previous time at the National Security Council, what your thoughts are on sort of the governmental structure between looking at the nexus between counterproliferation, non-proliferation, and counterterrorism efforts in the U.S. government?
Well, as you know, probably better than I do, that's an issue that's been wrestled with considerably within the government, and it's a hard problem. I know that, for example, there were provisions in law to name a nuclear terrorism czar, and I know that the White House, in good faith, wrestled with those issues. I mean, exactly where do you draw the line? You could say to someone, well, okay, now you're in charge of nuclear terrorism, and you want that person only to do work on nuclear terrorism issues so that he or she is not distracted by any other issues, because this is such an issue of such overriding importance. And I wouldn't disagree with any of that. But then the question becomes, well, does then that person not have a grounding in other terrorist activities? And to what extent would that person then be knowledgeable about a group that might go from conventional sorts of terrorism to nuclear terrorism? And if that person isn't being watched, would that person be detected within the nuclear terrorism apparatus, or the apparatus to confront nuclear terrorism? There are no clear-cut ways to divide these responsibilities to make sure that there is no overlap. And I think our most important interest is to ensure that there is no gap, and that we also understand well how we've divided those responsibilities so that we can work together across the two groups, because the efforts to counter terrorism and to counter proliferation are inevitably related, but have to some extent be separated if you're not going to just put one person in charge of so much policy that he or she can't function effectively.
Any final question? Yes.
I was just wondering about India and Pakistan and what kind of a threat they present. I've heard some intelligence experts say that they're not too worried, that they've kind of reached a balance of terror like the United States and the Soviet Union did, but still, especially Pakistan, is being described every day more and more as a failing state, and how secure or insecure is their weaponry?
Well, I guess you've raised two questions there, both their threat vis-a-vis each other, and then how secure their weaponry is at the end of your question. I'm not a regional expert. I would think that this, though, dealing with the India-Pakistan nuclear issue is something that the next administration would want to spend some time on. I think that it's possible the states can be informed by our experience with the Soviet Union and then Russia. We got through that period without making a fatal mistake, and I would hope that they could come through their experience as well as we have, and perhaps draw on ours for it. And there may be some opportunities for some diplomacy there. With respect to security, we would encourage the active participation of both states, or we had, I would now, in the Global Initiative to Combat Nuclear Terrorism, which enables states to get together and share best practices with respect to nuclear security in order to improve what they've got to the greatest extent possible.
Erica Lini from the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. I had a question about North Korea. There has been only a little bit of discussion. I've seen an article in Newsweek, and then CSIS touched on the question of whether a North Korea that could possibly implode politically after the death of Kim Jong-il could pose a threat for non-proliferation in terms of nuclear terrorism and people being able to sneak into a collapsed North Korean state, and how this risk is graver because there is very little cooperation between the United States and China, and we think that the most part of the nuclear arsenal in North Korea is along the Chinese border. What do you think about that? How likely is that scenario, and how should the U.S. deal with that?
Well, it's very difficult to know how such a scenario might unfold. There are different models where countries in Eastern Europe or the former Soviet bloc changed governments. Some did it completely peacefully and under conditions where military or even nuclear facilities remained completely secure. Others did it more violently, in which I don't know that there were nuclear facilities in those countries, but it would raise some concerns. I think that, at the signs of change, and change there will come one day. We don't know which day, but it will come one day. And perhaps even before, it bears discussion with China. The United States and China, I think, have grown much closer on this issue through the six-party talks. The whole goal of the administration was to infuse China with a sense of responsibility and ownership with regard to the North Korea nuclear issue. Not because we didn't want to have it, but because we thought that was the most effective outcome. They're the state with both, I think, the most at stake and the most influence to bear. And given those twin conditions, it makes sense that China would take the lead in hosting the six-party talks.
Any final questions? Then please join me in thanking Will for